The floor shook under me before the alarms even finished their first cycle. I remember gripping the edge of my seat, my knuckles white, watching the hull display fill with red shapes that outnumbered ours 10-1. Then the lights died, and I was falling through smoke that tasted like burnt wire. When I opened my eyes again, I was not falling anymore. I was kneeling. My wrists were bound behind me with something cold and smooth, not rope, not metal, something that felt alive under my skin. The air smelled wrong, sweet and thick, like flowers left too long in water. I blinked the haze away and saw the floor beneath me was black glass, polished so well I could see my own reflection staring back, bruised and tired. My name is Ethan Marsh. 2 hours earlier, I had been a pilot in the Terran Defense Fleet, flying escort for a supply convoy near the outer ring of a system we had no business defending, and every reason to. Now I was a prisoner, dragged through corridors that curved like the inside of a shell, past walls that pulsed faintly, as if the ship itself was breathing. They brought me into a chamber so large that my mind refused to measure it properly. The ceiling rose out of sight into darkness, and thin strands of light drifted down from somewhere above, slow and lazy, like snow that had forgotten how to fall. In the center of that vast space sat a throne carved from the same black glass as the floor, and on it sat someone I had only ever seen in blurry reconnaissance footage. The Queen of the Zarthali. I had heard soldiers describe her 100 different ways. Some called her a monster wrapped in silk. Others said she did not exist at all, that she was a story the enemy told to frighten us, a single face put on a war that had no single face. Standing before her now, chained and bleeding from a cut above my eyebrow, I understood that both descriptions were wrong. She was tall, taller than any human I had ever stood beside, with skin the color of deep water under moonlight, faintly shifting between blue and violet depending on how the light struck her. Her eyes were large, dark and calm in a way that unsettled me more than any weapon could have. She did not look at me the way a predator looks at prey. She looked at me the way a scientist looks at a puzzle that has finally been placed on the table in front of them. Guards on either side of her stood twice my height, their armor humming with a low current that made the hair on my arms rise. But she raised one hand, slender and long-fingered, and the room went still. Even the guards seemed to hold their breath. "Leave us," she said. Her voice was strange, layered, as if 2 or 3 voices spoke the same words a fraction of a second apart. The guards hesitated. One of them made a sound low in his throat, something between a warning and a protest. She repeated the command, softer this time, and they obeyed, filing out through an archway that sealed itself behind them with a sound like a held breath being released. Then it was just the 2 of us, and the silence of that enormous room pressed down on me like a physical weight. I had been trained for interrogation. Every pilot in the fleet went through the same drills, the same lectures about resisting pressure, about giving nothing away, about surviving long enough for extraction, or, if extraction never came, surviving long enough to matter less. None of that training prepared me for a queen who simply sat and studied me, unhurried, as if we had all the time in the galaxy and she intended to use every second of it. "You are afraid," she said finally. It was not a question, so I did not answer it as one. I kept my jaw tight and my eyes forward, staring at a point somewhere past her shoulder, the way we had been taught. She tilted her head, and for a moment I thought I saw something like amusement pass across her face, though it was hard to read expressions that belonged to no human ancestry. "That is the correct response," she continued. "Fear keeps you alive. It has kept your species alive for a very long time, hasn't it? Longer than it should have." I did not answer. My mouth was dry, and every part of my training screamed at me to give her silence and nothing else. She rose from her throne then, and the movement was so smooth it seemed to defy the weight of her own body. She descended the shallow steps toward me, and I felt the guard's absence more sharply with every step she took, because there was nothing between us now except the short chain that bound my wrists and my own 2 knees pressed against cold glass. She stopped an arm's length away and crouched, so that her eyes were level with mine. Up close I could see faint markings along her cheekbones, patterns that shifted slowly like ink dropped into water, and I understood, in some instinctive way, that these markings meant something to her people the way rank insignia meant something to mine. "Do you know how many ships my fleet has lost fighting yours?" she asked. I said nothing. "Neither do I," she said, and there was something almost bitter in the layered tones of her voice. "That is unusual. I am the queen. I am told everything, yet no one wants to give me that number anymore, because the number keeps changing, and it always changes in the same direction." She reached out, slowly enough that I could have pulled away if my body had obeyed me, and touched 2 fingers to the side of my jaw, tilting my face slightly, studying the cut above my eye, the bruising along my cheek, as though she were reading a report written directly onto my skin. Your fleet is smaller than mine by a number your language does not have a comfortable word for, she said. Your weapons are decades behind ours. Your ships break where ours only bend. Your soldiers die in numbers that should have ended this war 11 of your years ago. And yet here we are. She withdrew her hand and stood, turning from me to look out through a wall that was not a wall at all, but some kind of viewing surface that showed the black of open space and, far in the distance, the pale curve of a world I did not recognize. I have read your history, she said, or what your kind allows outsiders to read of it. Wars fought over lines drawn on maps that meant nothing a generation later. Wars fought over words, over gods, over borders, that shifted so many times no one alive remembered where they had first been drawn. You have always fought each other, long before you had anyone else to fight. It is, I confess, the least understandable part of you. I flexed my fingers behind my back, testing the binding, more out of habit than any real hope of escape. She noticed, of course. I got the feeling very little escaped her notice. Do not trouble yourself, she said, almost gently. There is nowhere for you to go. This ship is larger than some of your cities. You would starve in its corridors before you found a door that would open for you. She turned back to face me fully then, and something in her posture changed. Some tension I had not noticed until it eased slightly, as if she had been holding herself carefully, and had, for just a moment, allowed herself to stop. I did not bring you here to threaten you, she said. I have soldiers whose entire purpose is threatening. I have interrogators skilled enough to take apart a human mind and put it back together, missing whatever pieces I ask for. I did not choose any of them for this conversation. I chose to come myself. Why? I said. It was the first word I had spoken since the guards dragged me into that room, and my voice came out rougher than I expected, half question, half accusation. She studied me for a long moment before she answered. Because I want to understand something my advisors cannot explain to me, and my historians cannot explain to me, and 11 years of war has only made stranger instead of clearer. She stepped closer again, and this time she knelt fully, so that we were nearly at the same height, her dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made the vast room around us seem to shrink until it was only the two of us and the question she had clearly been carrying for longer than I would ever know. Your species should have surrendered by now, she said. By every measure my people use to understand war, you should have surrendered years ago. You have not. Ships that cannot win still launch. Soldiers who cannot survive still volunteer. Worlds that cannot be defended still refuse every offer of peace we extend to them. Offers that would spare their populations. Offers your leaders reject before they have even finished being spoken. Her voice dropped lower, and for the first time, I heard something in it that was not curiosity or command, but something closer to genuine confusion, the kind that had clearly been sitting in her for a long time, unanswered. So I will ask you plainly, human, and I would prefer the truth over whatever comforting lie your training has prepared you to give me. Why do you keep fighting when you know you cannot win? The question hung in the vast, glowing silence of that chamber, and I realized, kneeling there with my wrists bound and blood drying above my eye, that I did not have an easy answer ready. Every training module, every lecture on captivity, every rehearsed line of defiance I had ever memorized suddenly felt small and useless against the weight of what she was actually asking. I opened my mouth to speak, and for a moment, nothing came out at all. Because we don't quit, I said finally. It was the answer I had been trained to give, the one printed on recruitment posters and stitched into unit banners, the one every officer above me would have wanted me to say if they could have heard this conversation. It came out of me automatically, the way a password comes out of a tired mind at 3 in the morning, without thought, without weight. The Queen tilted her head, and the shifting marks along her cheekbones slowed, as though even they were unimpressed. That is not an answer, she said. That is a slogan. I have heard it before, from other captured pilots, from the recordings your own broadcasters play to your soldiers before battle. It is a sentence built to end a conversation, not begin one. I did not come here for a sentence that ends conversations. I felt heat rise in my face, more from being caught than from anger. She rose again, unhurried, and walked toward a section of the wall that shimmered faintly at her approach, resolving into something like a screen, though it had no frame, no edges, just light suspended in the air where a moment before there had been none. Let me show you what I mean, she said. Numbers appeared, more numbers than I could take in at once, columns of them stretching upward and sideways, symbols I recognized from human military reports mixed with characters I had never seen. Her own language, I assumed, running alongside ours in some kind of translation matrix. She gestured, and the numbers rearranged themselves into shapes, graphs that curved downward in ways that made my stomach tighten even though I did not fully understand what I was looking at. "This is your fleet's production rate over the last standard year," she said, tracing a line with one long finger. "This is mine. This is the rate at which your shipyards are destroyed compared to the rate at which they are rebuilt. This is the average age of a human pilot at the time of their first combat death." I could continue. I have continued, many times, for my own council, who ask me the same question I am asking you, though they ask it because they want permission to end this war on their terms, not because they wish to understand yours. She let the numbers hang in the air between us, glowing faintly, patient and merciless. "By any calculation my people trust, your species passed the point of rational resistance years ago," she said, "and yet you do not resist less, you resist more. Every year the numbers grow worse for you, and every year your recruitment increases instead of falling. I have run this pattern through every model my analysts possess, and none of them explain it. So when you tell me you fight because you do not quit, you are not answering my question, you are restating it back to me with more confidence than I asked for." I stared at the graphs, at the steady, brutal slope of a line that represented, somewhere inside its clean geometry, people I had trained beside, people I had watched not come home. I had never seen the war laid out like that before, stripped of flags and speeches and reduced to something as cold and simple as a falling curve. "You want statistics," I said slowly, "or you want the truth. Those aren't always the same thing." Something shifted in her expression, subtle, the kind of change I would have missed if I had not already spent every second in that room studying her face for any sign of what she actually wanted from me. "Go on," she said. I took a breath, choosing my next words more carefully this time, aware that whatever I said next would either open this conversation further or close it completely. "You keep asking why we don't stop when the math says we should," I said. "But you're asking the wrong question. You're asking like fighting is a business decision, like there's a spreadsheet somewhere back on Earth where someone adds up the losses and the gains and decides whether it's worth it to keep going. That's not how it works for us. It was never how it worked for us." "Then explain to me how it works," she said, and there was an edge in her voice now, not anger, something closer to hunger, the hunger of someone who has been circling the same locked door for a very long time, and has just heard, for the first time, a sound coming from the other side of it. I thought of my training again, the interrogation resistance drills, the endless warnings about giving an enemy anything they could use. But looking at the numbers still glowing faintly in the air, at the slow, careful patience in her posture, I understood that this was not an interrogation. Or if it was not the kind any of my instructors had ever prepared me for. She was not trying to extract fleet coordinates or troop numbers. She was trying to extract something my own commanders had never bothered to ask me for, because they had assumed the answer did not matter as long as I kept flying. "You said your council wants permission to end this war on their terms," I said. "What terms?" She studied me for a moment before answering, as if deciding whether I had earned the right to ask questions of my own. Then she waved a hand, and the graphs dissolved, replaced by something else, an image of a world, blue and green, half wrapped in cloud, orbited by wreckage that had once been ships. "Full surrender," she said. "Your remaining fleets disarmed. Your worlds placed under administration, your leadership replaced with councils appointed by mine. In exchange, the war ends immediately, and no further human world is targeted. And you think that's a good offer?" "I think it is a rational offer," she said. "It would save more lives on both sides than any other outcome I can currently model. My council believes I should have forced this offer through years ago, through whatever means necessary, and that my hesitation to do so is a weakness they are increasingly unwilling to tolerate." There it was, I thought, the first real thing she had told me, buried inside a sentence that sounded like policy but was, underneath, something far more personal. Hesitation, weakness, council growing unwilling to tolerate. I filed it away without letting my face show that I had noticed. "So why haven't you forced it through?" I asked, "if it's so rational." For a long moment she did not answer. The image of the wrecked world hung between us, silent testimony to a war that had clearly cost far more than either side's public reports admitted. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier composure, and for the first time since I had been dragged into that chamber, she sounded less like a queen delivering judgment, and more like someone thinking out loud, working through a problem she had not solved. Because the models that predict your surrender have been wrong every single time, she said. 11 years ago, my predecessors predicted this war would end within one of your calendar years. It did not. 5 years ago, my own analysts predicted that the destruction of 3 of your largest shipyards would force capitulation within months. It did not. 2 years ago, after we took your colony at the edge of what you call the frontier systems, my council was certain your government would negotiate rather than lose another world of that size. Instead, recruitment on your homeworld increased by a number my analysts still cannot fully explain. She looked at me then, and there was something raw in her expression, something I had not expected to find on the face of an alien queen who commanded a fleet large enough to erase entire star systems. Every model that treats you as a rational actor fails, she said, every single one. So either your species is not rational, which contradicts everything else I have observed about you, or I am missing some variable my models do not account for. I have spent years searching for that variable in reports, in interrogations, in the recovered logs of your dead. I have never found it. So I am asking you directly, because I am running out of other places to look, and because my council is running out of patience for my search. I sat with that for a moment, the chain still cold against my wrists, the strange, sweet air still thick in my lungs, and I realized that somewhere in the last few minutes, the balance of the room had shifted without either of us announcing it. I was still a prisoner. She was still a queen who could end my life with a single word to the guards outside that archway, but she had just told me something true, something that had clearly cost her to say, and I understood, with the instinct of a soldier who had spent years learning to read the smallest signs of an enemy's intentions, that she was not performing curiosity for some hidden purpose. She actually wanted to know. You're not going to like the honest answer, I said. I have not liked most of what this war has taught me, she said. I do not require comfort. I require truth. I looked down at my bound hands, then back up at her, at those large dark eyes that had been studying me since the moment the guards left the room, patient in a way that felt almost unbearable. The easy answer is the one I gave you first, I said. We don't quit. That's what they tell us. That's what gets put on the recruitment posters. That's the line every commanding officer says before a briefing that's really just asking us to fly into something we probably won't fly back out of. And it's not a lie, exactly. But it's not the truth either. It's the truth wearing a uniform. Then tell me the truth without its uniform, she said, and she sat down slowly on the floor across from me, close enough now that the distance between a queen and a prisoner had nearly disappeared, replaced by something neither of us had a name for yet. I opened my mouth to answer, and then, unexpectedly, I found myself thinking not of speeches or slogans, but of a small house at the edge of a town that no longer existed, and a promise I had made long before any of this war had a name. It doesn't start with the war, I said quietly. It starts before that. If you want the real answer, I have to tell you where I came from first. She said nothing. She only watched me, waiting, and for the first time since I had been dragged into that glowing chamber, I understood that she intended to listen to every word. I grew up in a small coastal town called Belhaven, on the edge of a continent that had already lost half its coastline to rising water by the time I was born. My mother worked the fishing boats, my father repaired the old seawalls that kept the town from slipping into the ocean one storm at a time, and neither of them ever talked about the stars, because the stars were not something people in Belhaven had the luxury of thinking about. We were too busy surviving the ground beneath our feet. I told the queen all of this slowly, choosing my words the way a man chooses footing on ice, because I did not yet know whether this honesty was wisdom or foolishness. But something about the size of that room, the strange dim light drifting down like snow, made it easier to speak than it should have been. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was simply that no one, not even my own commanders, had ever asked me to explain myself the way she was asking now. There was a girl, I said. Her name was Grace. We grew up 2 streets apart, went to the same school, same church some Sundays, though neither of us were particularly devoted. When the recruitment offices opened after the first contact reports came through, everyone said the same thing. That humanity finally had something bigger to worry about than itself, that maybe, for once, all our old fights would matter less. The queen's expression did not change, but I noticed the marks along her cheekbones had gone still, the way they had during the parts of our conversation she seemed to find most important. Grace enlisted before I did, I continued. She said someone had to go first, and it might as well be her, because she'd never been afraid of anything in her life. Not really. Not since we were kids, climbing the seawall her father told her never to climb. I remember standing at the transport station the day she left, telling her I'd follow when I finished my training rotation, and she laughed at me, said I always did things the slow, careful way, and one day that was going to get me left behind. I paused. The memory still had weight to it, even after everything since, even after years of war had piled newer losses on top of the old ones. She died in the Halverson engagement, I said. Second year of the war. I wasn't there. I was still in training, still learning to fly the ships we were losing faster than we could build them. I got the notice on a datapad in a barracks room I shared with 11 other recruits, and I remember reading it twice because the first time, I thought I had misread her name. The Queen was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, careful in a way that surprised me. "You fight for her," she said. "This is your variable. Grief." "That's what I thought too. For a while," I said. "It's a good story. Simple. The kind of thing that gets written into recruitment speeches. The fallen sweetheart. The soldier who fights to avenge her. But it's not true either. Not really. Not the way you mean it. I didn't re-enlist for the third time because I was angry about Grace. Anger burns out. I've seen it burn out in men twice as strong as me. What's left after the anger is something else." "Then what is left?" she asked. I thought about how to explain it and found myself reaching not for my own life, but further back, into the kind of history most humans only half remembered, the kind taught in schools as a list of dates rather than something that lived in a person's bones. "You said you've read our history," I said. "The wars over borders, the wars over words. You're right that we've spent most of our existence fighting each other, but you left something out. Every one of those wars, every disease that should have wiped us out, every famine, every disaster, every moment when the smart thing, the rational thing, would have been to give up, somebody didn't. Somewhere in every generation, there was always a group of people who looked at impossible odds and decided the odds were wrong, not them. That is not evidence of wisdom," the Queen said. "That is evidence of a species that does not know when it is lost." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it's evidence of a species that doesn't believe losing has ever been proven to hurt less than trying. Bellhaven should have been abandoned 2 generations before I was born. The engineers said the seawalls wouldn't hold, that the smart choice was to relocate the whole town inland and let the coastline go. My grandmother's generation stayed anyway, not because they thought they'd win against the ocean forever. They knew they wouldn't. They stayed because giving up the town meant giving up on something none of them could put a price tag on, and none of the smart, rational arguments ever managed to outweigh that." The Queen rose slowly and walked back toward the shimmering wall, where the graphs had hung earlier. She did not summon them again. Instead, she simply looked out at the stars beyond the glass, her back to me, and for a while neither of us spoke. "My people do not have a word for what you are describing," she said eventually. "We have words for duty. We have words for loyalty to the hive, to the Queen, to the collective good of the species. Those words are simple, because our society has always understood them the same way, for longer than your species has existed. But this thing you describe, staying somewhere you know cannot be saved, fighting for someone who is already gone, believing an outcome can be wrong even when every calculation says it is correct, we have no clean translation for that." "We call it hope, mostly," I said. "Though it doesn't always feel like the word suggests. Sometimes it feels like anger. Sometimes it feels like grief that never quite finishes. Sometimes it just feels like getting up in the morning because the alternative is worse." She turned back to face me, and there was something almost fragile in her expression now, a crack in the composed authority she had worn since the moment I first saw her on that throne. "You said Grace's death did not make you fight," she said, "but you also said you enlisted a third time. Explain the difference." "After Grace, I told myself I was done," I admitted. "I finished my training rotation because I'd already committed to it, and because quitting felt like it would make her death mean even less than it already did. But I told myself, once my term was up, I'd go home, find something else to do with my life. Let someone else fly the ships. What changed your mind?" I thought of the moment, sharper in my memory than almost anything else from those years, and found myself surprised at how easily it came back to me now, kneeling in an alien throne room half a galaxy away from where it happened. "There was a boy," I said, "younger than me, maybe 18, fresh out of the same training program I'd gone through. His name was Lucas. We flew together for about 6 months before I mustered out the first time. He used to talk about his little sister constantly, how she wanted to be a pilot too someday, how he was going to make sure the war ended before she was old enough to enlist, so she'd never have to see what he'd seen. He believed that, genuinely believed it. Not because the numbers supported it, because he needed something to believe, and that was the thing he chose." "Did he survive?" the Queen asked, and something in her voice told me she already suspected the answer. "No," I said. Neither did his sister, 3 years later, when she enlisted anyway, because by then the war had reached close enough to their home that staying out of it stopped feeling like a choice. The Queen said nothing for a long moment. The strange drifting light continued its slow fall around us, indifferent to everything being said beneath it. "So you re-enlisted for him," she said finally. "For his sister, for the town that stayed when the engineers said to leave. Your reasons multiply the longer this conversation continues. Which one is the truth?" "All of them," I said. "That's what you're missing. You keep asking for the variable, the one thing that explains why we don't quit. Like there has to be a single answer clean enough to fit into one of your models. There isn't. There's Grace, and there's Lucas, and there's his sister, and there's my mother mending nets on a boat that shouldn't have still been afloat, and there's 100 million people back on a planet you've never set foot on, each one carrying their own version of the same stubborn, irrational, completely human refusal to accept an ending just because it's the most likely one." I could see her processing this, turning it over the way I imagined she turned over battle reports and casualty projections, searching for the clean architecture beneath the chaos of it. But this was not something that had architecture. That was the whole point, and I wondered if she was capable of understanding a truth that refused to organize itself into anything her models could use. "You said earlier that no species in your empire's history has ever behaved this way and survived long enough to matter," I said, remembering something from the numbers she had shown me before. "Maybe that's not because we're the exception. Maybe it's because every other species you've conquered gave you a clean variable to work with. Maybe we're just the first one that never handed you the one thing that would have made all of this make sense to you." The Queen was quiet for a long time after that. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its earlier certainty entirely, replaced by something that sounded, for the first time since I had met her, almost like doubt. "If that is true," she said slowly, "then I have spent years asking my analysts to find a weapon that does not exist, and my council has spent years growing impatient with me for failing to produce one." She looked at me then with an expression I had not seen on her face before, something between exhaustion and reluctant respect, and for a moment, kneeling there in chains in the center of an enemy throne room, I felt less like a captured soldier, and more like the only person in the galaxy who had managed, for reasons neither of us fully understood yet, to say something to this Queen that no one else had ever dared to say. "Tell me more," she said. "Tell me everything. I want to understand what I have been fighting against for 11 years, and I am beginning to suspect none of my own people can tell me." I looked at her, this alien queen who commanded fleets large enough to erase worlds, sitting now on the floor of her own throne room like someone finally willing to listen. And I realized that whatever happened after this conversation, whether I lived or died, whether this changed anything at all for the war still raging beyond the walls of that ship, something between us had already shifted in a way that could not be undone. "All right," I said, "but it's going to take a while. Our history doesn't fit neatly into graphs either." For the first time since I had been dragged into that chamber, I thought I saw something that might have been the beginning of a smile pass across her face, quiet and uncertain, like someone standing at the edge of an idea too large to fully see yet. "I have time," she said. "I have had 11 years of it, and I intend to spend as much more as this requires." The doors of the chamber opened without warning, and the guards who had left earlier returned, flanking a third figure I had not seen before, an older Zarthali, with markings along his cheekbones that moved slower than the Queen's, faded in places, the way scars fade on skin that has healed many times over. He stopped just past the archway, and I felt the temperature of the room change, though nothing about the air itself had actually shifted. "Vesa," he said, and it was the first time I heard her name spoken aloud, though he said it the way a subordinate speaks to a superior they no longer entirely trust. "The council requests your presence." The Queen, Vesa, did not turn immediately. She remained where she was, still seated on the floor across from me, and for a moment, I thought she might simply ignore him. When she finally rose, it was slow and deliberate, the movement of someone reasserting an authority they had briefly set aside. "Tell the council I will attend when this is finished," she said. "This," the older Zarthali said, glancing at me with something between contempt and confusion, "is a captured human soldier. The council does not understand why you have spent 3 of your standard hours speaking with it, instead of extracting what value it holds through the proper channels." "The proper channels have given us nothing for 11 years, Doran," Vesa said, and there was an edge in her voice now that had not been there while she spoke with me. "Perhaps it is time someone tried something the proper channels never considered." Doran's eyes moved between the Queen and me, and I understood, even without fully knowing their politics, that I was witnessing something dangerous, a disagreement that ran deeper than this single conversation. the kind of tension that had probably existed long before I was ever dragged into that room. "The council will not wait indefinitely," he said. "There are already voices among them asking whether your judgment on this war remains sound. Every month you delay a decisive strike against their capital world. Those voices grow louder. I would not see you give them further reason." "Then leave, Doran," Vesa said, "before you give them a reason yourself." He held her gaze a moment longer, then bowed his head. Not out of respect, I thought, but out of the discipline that kept his species functioning as one hive, rather than 100 competing voices. He turned and left, the guards falling into step behind him, and the archway sealed shut once more, leaving us alone again, in the vast, glowing quiet. I watched Vesa carefully after that exchange, noting the tightness in her shoulders that had not been there a few minutes earlier, the way her hand had curled slightly at her side, not quite a fist, but close. "Your council doesn't trust you," I said. "My council has never needed to trust me," she said. "They have only needed to obey me. That has always been enough. Until recently." "What changed?" She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost the careful composure she usually wore like armor. "The war has cost us more than we tell your people, and more than I tell my own council in full," she said. "Doran believes I am hesitant because I am weak. He is not entirely wrong that I am hesitant. He is entirely wrong about why." She walked slowly toward the wide viewing wall again, and this time, when she gestured, the image that appeared was not a graph or a chart, but something closer to a memorial, a long, silent list of names and symbols scrolling upward faster than I could read, though I understood instinctively what it represented. "These are the crews of the ships we have lost since this war began," she said. "Not damaged, lost. Every name on this list belonged to someone, a hatchmate, a bonded partner. Children who will grow up in the collective nurseries without a parent to guide them personally, the way our custom requires. My people do not grieve the way yours do, not with the same rituals, but do not mistake that for an absence of grief. We feel the weight of every name on this list, whether or not our biology allows us to express it in ways your species would recognize." I watched the names scroll past, endless, and understood, with a kind of cold clarity, that this war had never been the one-sided slaughter that Terran command briefings sometimes implied when they wanted to justify the losses on our own side. "How many?" I asked quietly. "More than you have lost," she said. "Proportionally, perhaps not. Your species has fewer worlds, fewer resources, fewer ships to lose in the first place, so your losses feel more catastrophic to you, even when the numbers favor us in absolute terms. But my people did not expect this war to cost what it has cost. We were told, when it began, that this would be a brief campaign against a species too primitive to resist meaningfully. Instead, we have spent 11 years bleeding for a victory that continues to recede every time we believe we are close to achieving it." She let the list fade and turned back to me, and for the first time, I saw something in her that looked less like a queen studying an enemy, and more like someone confessing a burden she had been carrying alone for far too long. "Doran and the council believe the answer is more force," she said. "A decisive strike against your homeworld, sufficient to end the war in a single stroke, regardless of what it costs your civilian population. They have been proposing this for over a year. I have refused to authorize it." The words landed heavier than anything else she had said so far, and I felt my chest tighten, some old animal instinct rising up beneath the strange calm the last few hours had built between us. "Why haven't you?" I said carefully. "Because I do not believe it would end the war," she said. "I believe, based on everything you have told me in this room, that it would only prove to your species that surrender was never truly an option to begin with, and that the fighting that followed would no longer be waged by soldiers who could be captured and negotiated with. It would be waged by whoever remained, with whatever they had left, for as long as they drew breath. I do not think my people, however powerful our fleets, would survive the version of your species that emerges from an atrocity of that scale." I sat with that for a long moment, chains still cold against my wrists, and realized that the conversation happening in this room was no longer simply about satisfying the Queen's curiosity. It had become, whether either of us had intended it or not, something closer to the edge of a decision that could determine whether entire worlds lived or died. "You said hesitation," I said, "but that's not hesitation. That's you holding back the worst possible outcome of this war, alone, against your own council." "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps I am simply delaying an inevitability I lack the will to authorize myself, and telling myself a more comfortable story about restraint. I do not know anymore. That is, I think, the true reason I wanted to speak with you directly. rather than reading another report compiled by analysts who have never once looked a human in the eyes and asked them anything beyond tactical questions. She crossed the room again and knelt in front of me once more, closer than before, close enough that I could see the fine details of the markings along her cheekbones, moving slowly, deliberately, in patterns I still did not understand but had come, somehow, to find less alien than I expected. "I need you to understand what is actually at stake in this conversation," she said. "It is not merely my curiosity. If I return to my council without something they consider sufficient justification for continued restraint, Doran and the others who share his position will move against my authority. They have the numbers to do it. My hive does not depose its queens easily, but it has happened before, in ages long past this one, when a queen's judgment was believed to have failed her people beyond recovery. And if that happens," I said slowly, "Doran authorizes the strike." "Doran authorizes the strike," she confirmed, "against your homeworld, with every ship my empire can mobilize, and no restraint remaining to slow it. So when I ask you why your species keeps fighting a war it cannot win, understand that I am not merely asking out of philosophical interest. I am asking because the answer you give me may be the only thing standing between your world and an ending neither of us wants, though for very different reasons." The weight of that settled over me slowly, and I found myself looking at this queen, this alien commander who had, over the course of a few hours, gone from an unknowable enemy to something closer to a person carrying an impossible burden, and understood that whatever I said next mattered in a way I had not fully grasped when this conversation began. "Then I need you to actually understand the answer," I said, "not the summary, not the version that fits into a report for your council. The whole thing, even the parts that don't make you comfortable." "I am listening," she said, and for the first time, I believed her completely. Not as a queen extracting information from a captive, but as someone genuinely desperate to understand something that might save both of our species from a version of this war neither of us could survive. "Then ask me the question again," I said. "The real one, not the easy version you started with. Ask me like you actually want the whole truth, because I think, for the first time since I got dragged in here, you finally do." She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face, and then she asked it, slower this time, stripped of the clinical distance she had carried at the start of our conversation. "Why do you keep fighting, Ethan Marsh," she said, "when every rational measure says you cannot win?" And for the first time since the guards had thrown me down on that black glass floor, I felt ready to give her an answer that was not a slogan, not a story about one person or one town, but the truth underneath all of it, the thing I had never said out loud to anyone, not even to myself. I looked at the Queen for a long moment before I answered, and in that silence, I found myself thinking not of speeches, not of the war, not even of Grace or Lucas or his sister, but of something smaller and stranger that I had never told anyone in uniform, because it had never seemed like the kind of thing a soldier was supposed to admit. "When I was 12, I said, "there was a storm that hit Belhaven so hard it took out half the seawall my father spent years reinforcing. I remember standing on the hill above the town with my mother, watching the water come in, thinking there was nothing left to do but watch it happen. My father was down there anyway, him and about 30 other men and women, sandbags in the rain, trying to hold back something the engineers had already told them could not be held back." Vesa said nothing, but her attention had sharpened, the way it always did when I moved from explanation into memory. "I asked my mother why they were still down there," I said, "when everyone already knew the wall was going to fail. And she said something I didn't understand until much later. She said, 'They're not down there because they think they'll win tonight. They're down there because if they don't try, tomorrow will be worse, and the town needs to wake up tomorrow believing somebody tried.'" I let that settle for a moment before continuing. "The wall failed," I said. "Water got into 40 homes that night. Nobody died, but people lost things they couldn't replace. And the next morning, everyone who'd stood on that wall in the rain was down at the shoreline again, rebuilding, before the water had even fully receded. Not because they thought this time would be different, because giving up had never once been proven to hurt less than trying, and none of them were willing to be the first ones to test whether that was still true." I looked at Vesa, at the strange, calm patience she had carried through every version of her question, and I understood, finally, what I had been circling around since this conversation began. "That's the truth," I said. "Not the slogan version, the real one. We don't fight because we think we're going to win. Some of us know we're not. We fight because somewhere along the way, humanity decided that surrender has never once been proven to hurt less than resistance, and every generation that comes after us deserves the chance to find out for themselves whether that's still true. Instead of inheriting an answer, we handed them out of exhaustion. That is not strategy, Vesa said quietly. That is not even hope, not the way you described it earlier. No, I agreed. It's something underneath hope. Hope is what gets printed on posters. This is the thing hope is trying to describe and never quite manages to. Call it stubbornness if you want. Call it faith, though most of us wouldn't use that word out loud. But it's not really about winning or losing anymore, not for most of the people still fighting this war. It's about what kind of species we want to be able to say we were, when someone writes the history of this, whether we win or not. Vesa was silent for a long time. The drifting light continued its slow fall around us, indifferent, endless, and I watched her face for some sign of what she was thinking. But for the first time since our conversation began, I could not read her at all. You are describing an answer that cannot be defeated militarily, she said finally, and her voice had a strange, careful quality to it, as though she were speaking a realization aloud for the first time even to herself. If what you say is true, then Doran's strike would not end this war. It would simply prove your point for you, permanently, and whatever remained of your species after such an attack would carry that proof forward with a fury my people would have no answer for. Yes, I said simply. And if I do not authorize the strike, she continued, if I continue to restrain my council, this war continues indefinitely, costing both our peoples more names for that list I showed you, with no end visible from where either of us currently stands. Also yes, I said. She rose and walked back toward the viewing wall, and this time, when she gestured, no graphs appeared, no lists of names, only the quiet dark of space beyond the glass, stars scattered without pattern, indifferent to everything happening inside this ship. Then tell me what you believe should happen, she said, without turning around, not as a prisoner reciting what he thinks his captor wants to hear, as Ethan Marsh, who grew up on a hill watching a wall fail and rebuilding it anyway. What do you believe should happen now? I thought about the question longer than I had thought about anything else in that room, because for the first time, she was not asking me to explain my species. She was asking me, personally, what I believed the two of us standing in this chamber should do about a war that had already outlived every prediction either side had made about it. I think you already know the strike won't work, I said slowly. I think some part of you has known that for a long time, longer than you've been willing to say out loud to your council, maybe even longer than you've been willing to say it to yourself. And I think that's the real reason you came to talk to me, instead of sending an interrogator. You didn't need tactics. You needed someone to tell you the thing you already suspected was true, so you'd have something to stand on when you go back and tell your council no. Vesa turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression that looked almost like relief. The particular relief of someone who has been carrying a suspicion alone for a very long time, and has finally heard someone else say it aloud. If I refuse Doran's proposal, she said, I need more than restraint to offer the council in its place. Restraint without an alternative looks like weakness to them, and weakness is the one thing that will end my authority faster than any battlefield failure ever could. Then don't offer restraint, I said. Offer something else, something none of your predecessors ever tried, because none of them ever sat where you're sitting now, listening to someone tell them the truth instead of what they expected to hear. Explain. I took a breath, aware that whatever I said next would carry weight far beyond this room, beyond my own life, beyond even the war itself, if she chose to act on it. Offer real terms, I said, not the surrender you described earlier, the one that strips our worlds of everything that makes them ours. Actual terms, a ceasefire, negotiated between people who've both seen enough of this war to know neither side is walking away from it clean. Let my government know that there's a version of ending this that doesn't require our extinction or your total humiliation. Most wars in our history didn't end because one side crushed the other completely. They ended because someone on each side finally got tired enough and honest enough to say the fighting had stopped serving either of them, and found a way to stop it that let both sides keep something worth keeping. You believe your leadership would accept such an offer, Vesa said, after 11 years of losses, after everything your species has already sacrificed. I don't know, I admitted. Some of them won't. There are people on my side who've built their whole careers on this war continuing, the same way I'm guessing Doran has built his position on it ending in your favor. But I know there are people who would listen, if the offer came from someone who could prove she understood what she was actually offering, instead of another set of demands dressed up as diplomacy. Vesa was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something settle in her expression, a decision forming behind those large, dark eyes, slow and deliberate. The way I imagined every real decision she had ever made had formed, carefully, without the comfort of certainty. "If I bring this to my council," she said, "I will need something more than the word of a captured pilot to justify it. I will need proof that your government is capable of the same honesty you have shown me in this room." "Then send me back," I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "Not as a prisoner released out of mercy. As a messenger. Let me carry your offer to people who can actually act on it. Give me something concrete enough that they can't dismiss it as another trick, and I'll make sure it reaches the people who need to hear it." "You would return to a war that may still consume you," she said. "Even if I authorize this, there is no guarantee my council accepts it, and no guarantee your leadership listens. You would be walking back into the same uncertainty you walked out of, carrying the added weight of a decision that could determine the survival of both our species." "I've been walking into uncertainty since the day I enlisted," I said. "This isn't any different, except this time, for the first time in 11 years, there's a chance it ends with something other than another name added to one of those lists." Vesa studied me for a long moment, and something passed between us in that silence that I did not have a word for. Not quite trust, not quite understanding, but something adjacent to both, built slowly over hours of conversation that had started as an interrogation and become something neither of us had a name for yet. "You have given me an answer today that none of my analysts, none of my historians, none of my own advisors have ever managed to give me," she said finally. "I do not know if it will be enough to change what happens next. I do not know if my council will listen or if your leadership will believe a word of what I offer them. But I know that continuing this war on the assumption that your species will eventually break has already cost more than either of us can justify, and I am no longer willing to spend more lives testing a theory I now believe to be false." She raised one hand, and the chains binding my wrists loosened and fell away, dissolving into something like mist before they even hit the floor. I flexed my fingers slowly, feeling blood return to places that had gone numb, and looked up at her, uncertain what came next. "This does not mean the war ends today," she said, before I could ask. "It means I am choosing to risk everything I have built, my authority, my council's confidence, perhaps even my life, on the belief that the truth you gave me today is worth more than the strike Doran wants to authorize in its place. I am not certain I am right to trust this, but I have spent 11 years watching my own certainty fail me over and over, and I would rather fail trying something new than continue succeeding at nothing." I rose slowly to my feet, unsteady after hours kneeling on that cold glass floor, and for a moment, the two of us simply stood there, a human pilot and an alien queen, facing each other in the quiet, drifting light of a throne room that had somehow, over the course of one long conversation, stopped feeling like the center of an enemy empire and started feeling like the beginning of something neither of us could fully name yet. "Then let's find out if I'm wrong," I said. "About all of it." "Yes," Vesa said. "Let us find out together." They moved me to a smaller chamber after that, one with a real door instead of an archway that sealed like a held breath, and for the first time since my ship went down, I was given food that did not taste like it had been synthesized in a hurry, and water that did not carry the faint sweetness of the throne room's strange air. A guard named Kesh, one of the few who spoke to me directly rather than through the layered translation devices most of the crew used, told me the Queen had ordered me treated as an envoy rather than a prisoner, though he made it clear with the tightness in his voice that not everyone aboard agreed with that decision. I did not see Vesa again for 2 full days. I spent that time turning our conversation over in my mind, wondering how much of what I said had actually reached her, and how much would be undone the moment she stepped back into a council chamber full of people like Doran, who had built their entire understanding of this war on the assumption that force, applied with enough patience, eventually broke everything in its path. On the 3rd day, Kesh came to my quarters and told me the Queen required my presence. I followed him through corridors that curved and pulsed the way the rest of the ship did, past chambers I did not have clearance to see into, until we reached a room far smaller than the throne room, more of a private study than a hall of judgment. Vesa was waiting there alone, standing before another one of those shimmering, frameless screens, and when she turned to face me, I saw something in her posture that had not been there before. Exhaustion, yes, but underneath it, something that looked almost like resolve finally settled into place. "The council convened yesterday," she said, without preamble. "Doran presented his proposal for the strike against your homeworld, with the full support of 6 of the 9 seated members. I presented an alternative." My chest tightened. "And?" "It was not unanimous," she said. "Nothing involving this war has been unanimous among my council in years, but I did not need unanimous. I needed enough voices willing to delay Doran's strike long enough to test whether your leadership would respond to genuine terms. I secured 4 votes beyond my own, sufficient to grant me authority to attempt negotiation before any further offensive is authorized. That's not a majority, I said carefully. No, she agreed. It is a fragile balance, and if this negotiation fails, or drags on without visible progress, Doran will use that failure to overturn it entirely. I do not have unlimited time to prove that what you told me in that room was true, Ethan Marsh. I have perhaps a season, by your calendar's measure, before the council reconvenes and decides whether restraint has earned its keep, or whether it has simply cost us more time we cannot spare. She gestured, and the screen beside her resolved into a document, dense with text in both her language and a careful, formal version of mine, clearly the product of translators working through the night to render something precise enough not to be misread by either side. These are the terms I intend to offer your government, she said. A full ceasefire, effective immediately upon acceptance. No further offensive action against human worlds during the negotiation period. Withdrawal of Zarthali forces from 3 of the 6 frontier systems currently under our control, as demonstration of intent rather than final settlement. In exchange, I ask only that your leadership agree to formal talks, conducted in person, at a location we determine to be neutral for both species. I read through the terms slowly, aware of how carefully each line had been constructed, aware too of how much political risk each concession represented for a queen whose own council was already circling her with barely concealed impatience. This is more than I expected, I admitted. It is less than I wanted to offer, she said. My advisors would not permit more, not yet, not without proof that your side is willing to meet us part way. But it is, I believe, enough to demonstrate that I intend this seriously, and not as a delaying tactic while I regroup my fleets for a larger offensive, which is what Doran will tell your government to expect regardless of what I offer. They'll be suspicious, I said honestly. 11 years of this war, most of my leadership has never had a reason to believe your side wants anything but our surrender. Some of them will assume this is a trap no matter how it's presented. I am aware, Vesa said. That is why I am not sending this offer through any of the usual channels your government has learned to distrust. I am sending it with you. I looked up at her, uncertain I had heard correctly. With me. You will be returned to your fleet, she said, under a flag of truce that I will personally guarantee, carrying these terms directly, along with a full account of this conversation, unedited, exactly as it occurred. I want your leadership to hear not only the offer, but the reasoning behind it, from the one person who was actually present when I decided to make it. I believe that carries more weight than any formal transmission my diplomats could send. I thought of my commanders, of the officers who had spent 11 years learning to distrust every gesture the Zarthali made, and wondered how any of them would receive a message like this, delivered by a pilot who had spent 3 days aboard an enemy flagship instead of dying the way most captured soldiers eventually did. They might not believe me, I said. Then you will have to be as convincing with them as you were with me, Vesa said, and for the first time in days, I saw something close to a smile pass across her face, brief and uncertain, but real. I do not think that will be as difficult as you fear. You did not convince me with rehearsed arguments, Ethan Marsh. You convinced me by refusing to give me the easy answer, even when the easy answer would have ended our conversation faster and cost you less. I suspect the same honesty will serve you as well with your own people as it did with me. The transport that carried me back toward human space 3 days later was small, unarmed, marked with symbols my fleet's sensors would recognize as a formal truce vessel, a category of ship that had not been used in this war in longer than I had been alive. Kesh piloted it himself, silent for most of the journey, though near the end, as the pale outline of a Terran border checkpoint grew visible on the forward display, he spoke without turning around. The Queen risked more for this than you understand, he said. If your leadership rejects these terms, or worse, if they use this truce as an opportunity to strike against us while our guard is lowered, she will not survive what follows. Doran is waiting for exactly that outcome. I understand, I said, and I did, more than he probably realized. I had spent 3 days thinking of little else. The checkpoint crew nearly fired on us before the truce markings registered on their scanners, and even after they did, it took almost an hour of tense communication before they allowed the transport through, escorted the entire way by 4 fighters whose pilots clearly did not trust a single second of what was happening. I was brought before Fleet Command within hours of landing, questioned for most of a day by officers who reacted to my account with everything from open disbelief to barely restrained hope, and it was 3 more days before word came down that my report, along with the formal terms Vesa had entrusted me to carry, had reached the highest levels of Terran leadership. I do not know, even now, exactly what was said in the rooms where that decision was ultimately made. I was a pilot, not a diplomat, and once my report was delivered, my role in the official process was largely finished. But I know that 6 days after I landed, a formal response was transmitted back through the same truce channel Vesa had used to send me home. And I know that the fighting along the frontier systems went quiet in a way it had not gone quiet in 11 years. Not from exhaustion, not from a lull between offensives, but because both sides had, for the first time since this war began, agreed to stop and see what might exist on the other side of it. I never learned all the details of what followed in the months after, the slow, careful work of diplomats and translators and officers on both sides trying to build something durable out of terms that had started as a desperate gamble between a queen and a captured pilot. But I know the ceasefire held longer than anyone expected. I know Vesa survived Doran's challenge to her authority, though only barely, and only because the terms she had offered began, slowly, to produce results neither side could easily dismiss. And I know that somewhere in the vast records of a war that had cost both our species more than either could ever fully repay, there existed a single conversation, unremarkable in its setting, extraordinary in its consequences, between a human who told the truth because he had nothing left to lose, and a queen who was finally willing to listen. A year after the ceasefire took hold, I stood on a landing platform on a neutral station built specifically for talks between our two species, waiting for a transport I had been told carried an old acquaintance. The station itself was proof of how far things had come, a joint construction project between human engineers and Zarthali architects, its corridors deliberately built wide enough to accommodate both species comfortably, its air carefully balanced so that neither side found it uncomfortable to breathe. 11 years of war had produced weapons capable of erasing cities. It had taken barely 12 months of peace to produce something neither side had thought to build before, a place designed for both of us at once. I was no longer a combat pilot by then. Command had reassigned me shortly after my first debrief, uncertain what to do with a soldier who had somehow become the accidental architect of the most significant diplomatic breakthrough in the history of human contact with another species. For a while I resisted the reassignment, insisting I belonged back in a cockpit, back with the pilots I had trained alongside, most of whom were now flying escort for supply convoys through systems that no longer required escort at all. But eventually I accepted what had become obvious to everyone else long before it became obvious to me. I was more useful now as a voice in the negotiations than as another name on a flight roster, however uncomfortable that truth remained. The transport docked, and Vesa disembarked, no longer wearing the heavy formal robes of a throne room but something simpler, more practical, suited to travel between worlds that still eyed each other with more caution than trust. She looked older somehow, though I did not know enough about her species' aging to say whether that impression was accurate or simply a trick of memory layered over the year that had passed since I last stood in her presence. Doran attempted another challenge to my authority 3 months ago, she told me, once the formalities of the station's greeting protocols were finished, and we walked together along a corridor lined with windows that looked out over stars neither of our peoples had needed to fight over in some time. He argued that the frontier withdrawals had weakened our defensive position without corresponding gains, and that the Council should reconsider its support for continued negotiation. What happened? I asked, though something in her posture already told me the answer had not gone badly. The Council reviewed the trade agreements established in the past 6 months, she said. The resource exchanges, the shared research initiatives, the reduction in military expenditure on both sides, now that neither of us spends resources preparing for an invasion that is no longer coming. The numbers Doran once used against me now argue in my favor. He did not anticipate that outcome, and he has not attempted another challenge since. I found myself smiling at that, an old habit that still surprised me sometimes, remembering how impossible this kind of exchange would have seemed a little over a year earlier, kneeling in chains on a black glass floor, uncertain whether I would survive the conversation that started all of this. Grace would not have believed any of this, I said, more to myself than to her, though Vesa heard it anyway. The one you told me about, she said. Your friend from Belhaven. Yeah, I said. She died thinking this war would never end in anything but exhaustion on one side or the other. I think about that a lot, wondering what she'd say if she could see this station, see the two of us walking through it like it's the most normal thing in the world. I did not know her, Vesa said, but based on everything you have told me, I suspect she would recognize this outcome as exactly the kind of thing she believed possible, even when the math argued against it. You told me once that your people fight because giving up has never been proven to hurt less than trying. Perhaps this is what happens when someone finally tries something other than fighting, and it turns out that choice was never proven to hurt less either. We reached the observation deck near the end of the corridor, a wide chamber with windows stretching from floor to ceiling, showing the slow turn of a star system that had once marked the bloodiest stretch of frontier in the entire war. Now it held nothing but quiet traffic, human and Zarthali vessels moving past each other, on routes that no longer required armed escort, engaged in commerce instead of combat. "There is something I never told you," Vesa said, watching the traffic move below us. "During those 3 hours in the throne room, before I ever asked you my final question, I had already decided what I would do if your answer failed to convince me. Doran's strike plan was already prepared. I had approved the preliminary staging orders that morning, contingent only on the outcome of our conversation. If you had given me the slogan again, the easy answer, I do not know that I would have found the will to refuse him a second time." The revelation settled over me slowly, heavier than I expected even a year removed from the danger it represented. I thought of the moment in that chamber when I had almost given her exactly that, the rehearsed line about not quitting, and felt something cold move through me at how close the entire outcome had come to tipping the other direction. "I didn't know that," I said quietly. "I did not tell you because I did not want the weight of it influencing what you chose to say," she said. "I wanted the truth, not a performance calculated to save your homeworld through whatever means necessary. I am grateful now that you gave me both, without knowing you were giving me both." I looked out at the quiet traffic moving beneath the station, ships that belonged to two species who had spent 11 years trying to destroy each other, now sharing the same stretch of space without a single weapon raised between them, and thought about how strange it was that something as small as one honest conversation, one refusal to reach for the easy answer, had ended up carrying more weight than every battle fought in the years before it. "What happens now?" I asked. "Between us, between our people?" "I do not know," Vesa admitted. "My historians tell me no war in our recorded memory has ever ended this way, negotiated rather than won, and none of them can promise me the peace that follows will hold indefinitely. Your species has taught me that the future is rarely as predictable as anyone's models suggest, for better and for worse. I have learned to be less certain than I once was, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I do not mind the uncertainty as much as I expected to." "Neither do I," said, and meant it, standing there beside a queen who had once asked me why my species refused to accept the inevitable, now looking out at a future neither of us could fully predict, built not on the certainty of victory, but on the fragile, stubborn, entirely human belief that trying was always worth more than the alternative, whether or not the numbers ever agreed. Below us, the ships kept moving, quiet and unremarkable, carrying cargo instead of weapons, and for the first time since the war began, that ordinary sight felt like the most extraordinary thing either of our species had ever built together. 2 years after the ceasefire, I received a message that pulled me away from the quiet desk job I had settled into on the neutral station, a short, urgent transmission from Kesh, the same guard who had once piloted me home under a flag of truce. He told me Doran had not disappeared after his failed challenge to Vesa's authority. He had simply gone quiet, gathering support among the parts of the council that still believed peace was a temporary weakness rather than a lasting solution, and now, with a faction of his own hive behind him, he was preparing to act without her permission. I read the message twice before I understood what it actually meant. Doran was not planning another vote. He was planning to bypass the council entirely, using a fleet loyal to him personally, to strike at one of the frontier systems Vesa had withdrawn from during the early negotiations, a system that had since become home to a small joint colony, humans and Zarthali living and working together for the first time in either species' history. If that colony burned, there would be no diplomatic language left capable of holding the peace together. Both sides would read it as proof that the other had never intended to keep faith at all. I did not think twice about what I needed to do. I boarded the fastest transport the station had available and set a course for the colony myself, sending word ahead to both Terran Command and Vesa's flagship, though I had no way of knowing which message would arrive first, or which side would be able to respond in time. The colony was called Ashwell, a name some homesick engineer had given it after a town that no longer existed back on Earth, not unlike Belhaven in that regard, a place people had chosen to build despite every reasonable argument that it could not last. Its habitats rose out of a rust-colored plain in a mix of human architecture and the smoother, curved lines of Zarthali design. The two styles blended in a way that should have looked strange and instead looked, to my eyes at least, like something worth protecting. I arrived less than a day before Doran's fleet did, enough time to warn the colony's joint council and coordinate a defense that had never been intended for combat, built instead around agricultural equipment and small transport ships, never meant to face anything larger than an asteroid survey. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. But it delayed Doran's forces by hours that mattered more than I understood until later. Hours that gave Vessa's own fleet, moving faster than any diplomatic protocol technically allowed, time to arrive before Ashwell's defenses collapsed entirely. I watched from the colony's central tower as two Zarthali fleets met in the space above us, one flying under Vessa's banner, one under Doran's. The first time since the ceasefire that weapons of that scale had been fired in anger, though this time the anger was not pointed at humanity at all, it was pointed inward, at a fracture within Vessa's own people that the peace itself had finally forced into the open. The engagement was short. Doran's fleet, built on the loyalty of officers who believed in his cause more than they believed in the numbers behind it, broke faster than either side expected once it became clear Vessa had not hesitated, had not shown the restraint Doran had always accused her of lacking the will to abandon. I learned later that Doran himself did not survive the engagement, and that the officers who had followed him were given a choice: submit to the council's authority, or be stripped of their commands entirely. Most chose submission. A war within a war, ended in less time than it took most negotiations on the station to settle a single trade dispute. Vessa came to Ashwell herself 3 days later, walking through the colony's damaged outer ring with an expression I had only seen once before, in the throne room, in the moment right before she asked me why my species refused to accept the inevitable. This time, though, the question in her eyes was different. This time, I think, she already knew the answer, and simply needed to see the proof of it standing in front of her. "You did not have to come here," she said, once we were alone in what remained of the colony's central hall, its windows cracked but still holding, the joint architecture of two species scarred but not broken. "Neither did you," I said. "You could have let your council handle it, sent someone else, kept your own risk lower. I have learned, over the past 2 years, that the risks worth taking are rarely the safe ones," she said. "You taught me that, whether you intended to or not." I looked out through the cracked window at the colony beyond, humans and Zarthali working side by side to clear debris, repair habitats, tend to the wounded of both species without distinction, and thought about how far this had come from a throne room where I had knelt in chains, uncertain whether I would survive the conversation that started it all. "Doran was wrong about one thing," I said. "He thought peace was weakness, but it took more courage to hold this together than it ever took to keep fighting. Fighting is easy, in a way. Everyone already knows how to do it. Nobody ever taught either of our species how to do this." "Then perhaps that is the answer to a question I never finished asking you," Vessa said. "Not merely why your species keeps fighting, but what you are willing to build once you finally stop." I thought of Grace, of Lucas and his sister, of my father on the seawall in the rain, of every person on both sides of this war who had given up more than they should have had to, and looked out at Ashwell's colonists working together in the wreckage of an attack meant to prove that peace could not last. "This," I said, "this is the answer, not because it's easy, and not because it's guaranteed to work, but because giving up on it has never once been proven to hurt less than trying to hold it together, and I don't think either of our species has any interest in finding out otherwise, not anymore." Vessa was quiet for a long moment, watching the colonists below, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a kind of certainty I had not heard from her before, not the confidence of a queen commanding a fleet, but something steadier, something that had been built slowly, conversation by conversation, choice by choice. Across 2 years neither of us could have predicted from where we started. "Then we build it," she said, "for as long as it takes to prove the numbers wrong again." Ashwell was rebuilt within the year, its damaged habitats restored, its population larger than before, drawing colonists from both species who had heard what happened there and wanted to be part of a place that had survived an attempt to unmake it. I stayed longer than I had planned, helping coordinate the joint council that governed it, and found, somewhere in those months of ordinary work, rebuilding walls and settling disputes, and watching children of both species grow up together without ever having known a war between their people, that I had stopped thinking of the peace as fragile. It was not perfect. There were still voices on both sides who distrusted it, still tensions that flared and had to be carefully managed, still moments when the whole fragile structure seemed like it might come apart under the weight of old grievances neither side had fully let go of. But it held, season after season, longer than Doran had believed it could, longer than even I had quietly feared it might. Years later, Long after I had stopped counting how many seasons had passed since that first conversation in the throne room, I stood again on Ashwell's rebuilt central tower, watching a new generation of children, human and Zarthali both, running through streets that had once been battle lines, laughing in a language that had become, somewhere along the way, a comfortable blend of both our tongues. Vesa stood beside me, older now, her authority long since secured beyond any council's ability to challenge it, and neither of us spoke for a while, content simply to watch what had been built out of a war that had once seemed like it would never end. "They will never know how close this came to not existing," she said eventually. "No," I agreed, "and maybe that's the point. Maybe that's what all of it was for. Not so we'd remember how bad it almost got, so they'd never have to." Below us the children kept running, unaware of the throne room, the chains, the graphs that had once predicted an ending neither side wanted, unaware of everything except the ordinary, unremarkable freedom of an afternoon that belonged to them and no one else, and I understood, standing there beside a queen who had once asked me why my species refused to accept the inevitable, that we had finally found an answer worth more than any victory either side could have won through fighting alone.